In the autumn of 1943, on a humid and battered airfield in Rabaul, an intelligence report circulated among Japan's elite naval aviators. It described a newly deployed American fighter, a heavy and powerful aircraft the Americans called the Hellcat. One of the men who studied this report was Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces. Just a year earlier, over Guadalcanal, enemy fire had torn through his cockpit, leaving him severely injured. A bullet had grazed his skull, shards of glass had destroyed his right eye, and yet in what many deemed a miracle, he flew his damaged Zero for nearly 5 hours and more than 560 nautical miles, returning home blind in one eye. Now serving as a trainer, Sakai scanned the specifications of this new American machine with his remaining good eye and laughed. He was not the only one. To the proud pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, long-standing masters of the Pacific sky, the report read like an overestimation or a misunderstanding. They saw the Hellcat, nearly twice the weight of their beloved A6M Zero, as a sluggish brute. To them, it embodied the same flawed American philosophy they had mocked for years, trying to replace skill, finesse, and spirit with metal and machinery. Through the tent flaps, Sakai could see the elegant Zeros that had delivered Japan 2 years of air superiority. These fighters were nimble, graceful, and deadly, the steel reflection of the samurai ideal. The newly arrived Hellcat, they believed, would simply become another easy victim. But what Sakai and his comrades could not yet imagine was that their laughter marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in the Pacific Air War. They misunderstood the Hellcat because they misunderstood the coming change. They believed air combat was a duel, an art. The Americans were about to prove that air combat could also be an industry. The Hellcat was not built for gallant, one-on-one contests. It was built as a systematic instrument of war. This is the story of how that early laughter gave way to alarm, how a plane mocked for its weight achieved one of the most staggering victory ratios in aviation history, and how it overwhelmed an empire's air arm one engagement at a time. To understand why Japan dismissed the Hellcat, one must first understand the shock of the Zero. In the opening year of the Pacific War, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero stunned Allied pilots. It entered combat as a superior weapon, so agile and so advanced that many Allied aviators believed it must be almost mythical. Light, responsive, and unmatched in maneuverability, it outturned anything the Americans or British could send against it. P-40 Warhawks, F4F Wildcats, Brewster Buffaloes, one by one these aircraft found themselves struggling against the Zero's agility and the deadly skill of its pilots. And these were no ordinary pilots. Japan's naval aviators were graduates of the harshest aviation training program in the world. By 1941, the average Japanese Navy pilot had over 700 flight hours, much of that gained in real combat over China. They were a warrior elite, immersed in Bushido, viewing aerial combat not as a tactical science but as a personal test of spirit and superiority. Saburo Sakai embodied this mindset completely. Determined, relentless, and highly skilled, he had risen to legendary status. With pilots like him in the cockpit, Japan believed its dominance was unshakable. The numbers seemed to confirm it. Over the Philippines and beyond, Zero pilots destroyed Allied aircraft in large quantities while suffering very limited losses. The fighter had the range of a bomber and the agility of a biplane, a combination that defied conventional logic. Allied pilots who tried to dogfight against it on equal terms found themselves outturned, outpositioned, and then shot down in bursts of cannon fire. The American F4F Wildcat, though tough and famously durable, earning the nickname Grumman Iron Works, was slower, less nimble, and inferior in climb. Its pilots survived by inventing defensive tactics like the Thaku-Eve, a coordinated maneuver where two fighters could protect each other from a pursuing Zero. But these were survival methods, not tools for domination. They could prevent slaughter, but they could not seize control of the sky. Many Allied pilots felt they were trapped in inferior machines, simply trying to endure. So when Japanese pilots laughed at the early reports of a heavier American fighter, it was not simple arrogance, it was the confidence of men who had enjoyed a full year of unquestioned aerial supremacy. They had every reason to believe the trend would continue. But they were wrong. The age of the Zero was nearing its end. The US Navy needed a solution, and it needed one quickly. The lesson was clear. The next American fighter could not merely imitate the Zero, it had to counter it. That effort did not begin in a laboratory, but with the first-hand testimony of Wildcat pilots returning from combat. Grumman engineers listened closely as these men described their frustrations, watching the Zero outturn them, outclimb them, and slip away before they could react. They learned the Zero's strengths, but more importantly, they began cataloguing its weakness. The surviving Wildcat pilots had learned the Zero's weaknesses through bitter experience. Those who lived through encounters did so by exploiting its limited flaws. The Zero could not keep up in a fast, controlled dive, and at high speeds its controls became stiff and unresponsive, robbing it of its turning advantage. Its ultralight construction also came with a price. It lacked armor, had no self-sealing fuel tanks, and could be crippled by a few well-placed 50-caliber hits from a Wildcat. While engineers gathered this frontline feedback, the United States received an unexpected breakthrough. In June 1942, during a raid on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's Zero suffered engine trouble and crash-landed on Akutan Island. The landing gear caught in soft terrain, flipping the aircraft and killing Koga, but his Zero remained nearly intact. This Akutan Zero became an intelligence windfall. It was recovered, shipped back to the US, and subjected to exhaustive flight testing. For the first time, American engineers could examine their enemy's prized fighter in detail. What they discovered confirmed pilot reports. The Zero was a triumph of lightweight design, but its maneuverability came at the expense of protection, structural strength, and modern equipment. What Japan hailed as an ideal flying weapon, Grumman's engineers recognized as a fragile system built on dangerous compromises. Armed with this knowledge, the blueprint for a counter-weapon became obvious. Leroy Grumman and his team did not attempt to build a more agile dogfighter. They chose instead to build a heavyweight Predator. Rather than outturn the Zero, the new fighter would dominate through speed, dive power, durability, and overwhelming fire. Their design, already underway, was now supercharged with fresh intelligence. Grumman engineers selected the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower engine that became the core of the design philosophy. This fighter would be heavier, but its weight would serve purpose. Armor plating around the cockpit and engine, self-sealing tanks to prevent fiery deaths, and 6.5 caliber Browning machine guns to deliver blistering firepower capable of shredding a Zero in seconds. Where the Zero sacrificed the pilot, the Hellcat would protect him. Where the Zero was nimble, the Hellcat would be powerful. So when Japanese officers mocked the Hellcat's size, they were simply judging it by their own outdated rulebook. They did not realize the Americans were writing a new one. When the F6F Hellcat arrived in mid-1943, it stood in complete visual contrast to the elegant Zero. Squat, broad, and purposeful, it looked every bit the brute Japan dismissed. But beneath its shape lay a radical doctrine built around that R2800-800 powerhouse. Its climb rate, top speed, and high-altitude performance allowed a Hellcat pilot to decide when to fight and when to break away. If the situation soured, the Hellcat could simply disengage. Wrapped around this engine was a rugged airframe built with Grumman's unbending philosophy: bring the pilot home. More than 200 pounds of armor shielded vital areas, its windscreen was bullet-resistant, and damaged Hellcats frequently returned to carriers full of holes, yet still flyable. This survivability allowed the US to preserve its most valuable resource, trained pilots, and those pilots were armed with 6 Browning M2s, a withering storm of fire ideal for detonating the Zero's unprotected fuel tanks. Meanwhile, Japanese analysts fixated on weight charts. A Zero weighed 6,000 pounds, a fully loaded Hellcat over 12,000. To them it was simple: the Hellcat could never win a turning duel. In that narrow calculation they were right, but they failed to grasp that the Hellcat would never fight such a duel at all. This technical mismatch crashed headlong into a widening training disaster. Japan's elite pre-war aviators, masters like Sakai, were being lost faster than they could be replaced. The brutal training program that once produced warriors with 700 flight hours could not be sustained during wartime. By 1944, new Japanese pilots arrived at the front with only minimal experience. The US, by contrast, had turned training into a factory system. New American aviators reached the Pacific with 500-600 hours, often with 200 in the Hellcat alone. America was not only fielding a superior aircraft, it was mass-producing superior pilots. When Hellcats first clashed with Zeros in large numbers in late 1943, Japanese expectations collapsed almost immediately. The Hellcats refused traditional dogfights, instead employing a cold, calculated tactic: boom and zoom, climb high, dive fast, strike in a single slashing pass, then climb away before the Zero could react. If a Zero tried to chase, its controls stiffened in the dive, or its engine fell behind in the climb. Team tactics like the thack weave only compounded the imbalance, turning the Zero's once fearsome turning ability into a liability. Japanese pilots who had once dominated the skies now found themselves overwhelmed. Reports came back filled with disbelief. This new American fighter did not lumber, it pounced, it killed with terrifying speed and vanished before they could respond. The psychological shock was immense. This rising dread reached its breaking point on June 19, 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan launched Operation Ago, sending nearly 450 aircraft to crush the American fleet in what they hoped would be a decisive blow. Instead, thanks to superior radar, organization, and swarms of F6F Hellcats, the attack dissolved into catastrophe. Guided by carrier fighter directors, American pilots intercepted the incoming waves and cut them down. Many of the attackers were poorly trained replacements. They flew straight into a storm of coordinated Hellcat fire. Speed, armor, and firepower had prevailed. One American pilot later joked, "Why, hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot became a symbol of the turning tide, as more than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the first day alone, while only about 30 American planes were lost. But what of the one-eyed ace who once laughed at the Hellcat? Saburo Sakai was no longer fighting on the front lines. His injuries had left him an instructor, stationed on Iwo Jima in June of 1944, watching the young men he trained fly off into brutal battles. He had taught them the art of the dogfight, the very skills that had made him a legend. Now he listened as the pilots who survived returned with grim stories of a blue fighter that could not be outturned, could not be outrun, and seemed impossibly tough. The laughter in the operations tent a year earlier had curdled into the bitter realization of a master watching his art become obsolete, and his students thrown into battles they could not win. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot may have been the Hellcat's most famous moment, but the aircraft's dominance was far from finished. For the remainder of the war, the F6F Hellcat reigned as the most formidable American fighter in the Pacific. The final tally was staggering. In just 2 years of frontline combat, the Hellcat was credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft in US and British service, 56% of all Navy and Marine air-to-air victories of the entire war. Against these thousands of kills, only 270 Hellcats were lost in dogfights, producing an astonishing victory ratio, often summarized as 19-1. The Hellcat earned a fitting nickname, the Ace Maker. An incredible 305 US Navy pilots became aces while flying it, more than in any other American fighter. Men like Captain David McCampbell, the top Navy ace with 34 victories, became legends at its controls. The Hellcat wasn't merely powerful, it was forgiving, steady, and above all, it brought its pilots home. Each returning pilot became more experienced, more lethal, and more confident. For Japan, however, the consequences were devastating. The loss of veteran airmen became an irrecoverable wound. By war's end, nearly all the elite pre-war pilots had been lost, and their replacements were rushed into combat with little training. This collapse eventually led to Japan's most tragic tactic, the kamikaze. The rise of organized suicide attacks was the ultimate admission that Japan had lost the air war. When the average pilot could not survive more than a single encounter, the pilot himself became the weapon. Kamikaze strikes were a grim final act, born from desperation against an enemy whose aircraft and industrial system they could no longer match. Years later, Saburo Sakai reflected on the war he survived. He never lost admiration for his beloved Zero, which he considered the purest expression of aerial combat, but he accepted a harsh truth. The Zero was the better fighter, he reportedly said, but the Hellcat was the better weapon system. Another quote, often attributed to him, captured the emotional reality of Japan's defeat. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war did so because a Hellcat pilot chose to spare him. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, the sentiment reflected the truth. Japan had gone to war with a beautifully crafted weapon, believing themselves modern samurai. The Hellcat proved they were merely men facing a future of machines, radar, factories, and systems they could not overcome. So, the story of the Hellcat versus the Zero is more than a duel between two airplanes. It is the story of two philosophies of war colliding in mid-air. Japan placed its faith in individual skill, agility, and warrior spirit, the belief that a superior man could overcome any material disadvantage. America embraced a different doctrine, systems, overwhelming power, mass production, coordination, and above all, the survival of the pilot. The F6F Hellcat became the perfect symbol of that American idea. It wasn't built to win glamorous duels, it was built to win a war. It was heavy because that weight protected the man inside. Japanese pilots mocked what they didn't understand. Every pound of that airplane represented radar coordination, training, firepower, armor, and industry. When the laughter finally stopped, Japan's air power had been shattered. The plane they ridiculed had not only defeated their legendary Zero, it had rendered its entire purpose obsolete. The one-eyed ace Saburo Sakai lived to see peace, a monument to a vanished era of aerial combat overtaken by industrial precision. The Hellcat proved that in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon is not always the sharpest sword, but the most relentless system. If you enjoyed this story of how technology and strategy reshaped the Pacific Air War, hit the like button and subscribe for more military history deep dives. And tell us in the comments which iconic matchup should we cover next.